Hi, everybody. Welcome to ZealZaddy. I'm Scott. My pronouns are he, him, and this is Story Talk. And I'm slightly off center, and that annoys me, which is weird because I like asymmetry. How weird. So you can follow us everywhere at ZealZaddy, or if you're on TikTok at ZealZaddy RPG. You can use the clip command during the show. That's !clip to save little snippets of things you really find interesting. You can save. We are a partner with Only Crits, and we love their dice. You should check them out. We have beautiful dice. We've done 2 giveaways in the last year. Every now and then we'll bring up another one. We'll do a giveaway. They go right away. Everyone loves them. This is Story Talk, where we talk about all the things that matter to players, GMs, and creators in the TTRPG industry. Tonight we're going to be talking about why fantasy dominates TTRPGs and whether it will or should continue to do so. And if there's even anything that can be done about it. There's a lot of depth to this story. I mean, obviously in the last year, we've seen some fractures that we'll probably get into a little bit tonight. But, fantasy, since in my entire gaming life, I don't want to say how long that's been, has been fantasy. But I've always loved science fiction and horror, and I love cozy games, and you put it in front of me and I'm willing to play it, and I will have a great time with it. By the way, I'm wearing lately my pork pie hat because I've been running Old Gods of Appalachia for the last 2 or 3 months, and I have one more big series coming up in a couple months, in a couple weeks, I mean. So I can't get enough of the hat. I loved it at PAX Unplugged. It was so fun to have around. It actually helped me get noticed by some people, which that is an amazing experience. If you have questions, just drop them in chat. Type question before it if you can. That'd be great to make it easier for me to find. At intermission, I will be running some clips from our last couple of Old Gods of Appalachia mini campaigns. They're each mini. They're about 8 to 10 episodes. And I hope you have a little bit of fun with that. Our intermission is about 5 minutes, enough for us to go to the bathroom, get a drink or something. And then we will continue again. So this is going to be an amazing show tonight. Let me bring everybody on because we have 3 amazing guests that I'm super excited to have here, 2 of which are returning guests, and 1 is our newbie guest. NewbieDM is our newbie guest. I'm super excited for you to get to meet all of them. Why don't we go around and let everyone say who they are, where they can be found. Why don't we start with you, Enrique?
All right. Well, hi, everybody. First of all, thank you for inviting me on the show. Scott, very happy to be here. So hi, everybody. Yeah, I go by NewbieDM on Twitter. I have a website, newbiedm.com. I'm mostly just hanging around. At this point, I'm just hanging around talking about RPGs all day. I don't really have much. I don't really have much to promote. I have some stuff up, RPG Kids. You can find drive through, but mostly I'm just around talking and taking in everybody's wisdom. Not even sharing my own because I don't really have. I'm here to learn.
If you're learning,
thank you. but thank you for inviting me. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. All right, Gwen.
Hi, I'm Gwen Marshall, she, her pronouns, and you can find me online at Dr. Gwen Marshall at all the socials. I have, about 15 items maybe on drive-through and half a dozen more on DM's Guild under Gwendolyn Marshall. I have a small press called Arcanist Press that publish a bunch of books in a series based on my book Ancestry and Culture, an alternative to race in 5e that came out a few years ago. Since recently I've been doing freelance work. I'm a college professor by day, and I look forward to today's conversation. Thanks, Scott.
All right. And Nathan.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I've gone by the Amethyst Dragon online for getting close to 3 decades now. I make homebrew stuff for D&D, 5th edition, but I've been doing stuff ever since 2nd edition. Currently working on a book that kickstarts in March. It is a giant of a book that has everything I've made and put online, plus stuff I've made just for the book. I talk about D&D stuff a lot. I turn anything into D&D stuff. And I like to talk to people about games. I do some tabletop gaming, local conventions, stuff like that. So I have fun with it.
Well, I'm super happy to have all of you here. I'm going to start off with the simplest question, the easiest one, and you can jump in and answer all you want. Does fantasy dominate because it was first? Is that the only reason? Is it as simple as that?
I would say yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say
Partly because
yes.
it's first.
Then I'm going to challenge something in there. I kind of felt that was where it was going to fall. So when it was coming out, the zeitgeist was obviously Tolkien was exploding, but so was the space race. We had just landed on the moon right before it was invented. How did science fiction not become the big system? Like, the world was on fire for science fiction. I mean, Dune had come out, and Asimov's Foundation, and there was only one series of books that everybody knew in fantasy.
I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'll take this one first. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that if pulp novels, and I'm talking about the sci-fi pulp season in the 70s, had found a way to be turned into a game, like what's it called? It's chainmail, right? If pulp novels of the 60s and 70s have found a way into a miniature combat game, like chainmail did, turn fantasy into a combat game, then I think we're in a different conversation, right? I just think that fantasy first by circumstance. They turned the genre into a game, and then it spun off from there. I think it could have been anybody's game had someone done it first.
Mm-hmm.
If John Carter of Mars had been turned into a war game, we'd be having pulpy RPGs from day one. Now that those genres are now playing catch up to D&D, I really just think that's just the way it happened.
I think that could be part of it. And also I think a lot of the science fiction that was out around the same time, a lot of it was more entertainment than, let's pretend we're in it. Although I can recall as a kid, pretending I was in Star Wars because that was the thing. But we've had fairy tales forever. Science fiction is relatively new as far as stories go, at least I think so.
That's true.
I mean, I can just steal the story from like John Peterson and historians of the game, right? They report that 19th century, Napoleon used miniature sets to plan battles. In the early 20th century, military colleges started doing wargaming on tabletops. H.G. Wells was inspired by this, and he built a game he played at his home with his friends, which is funny because he's the sci-fi author. He's one of the great founders of science fiction, and he played 19th century military war games at home with his friends. Those developed into the tradition of wargaming that was very military recreationist focused. And then when Tolkien came out and got big, those two blended. Somebody said some of the war games looked at whole armies, but others of them looked at just like you're just this platoon or even just these 6 guys, right? And what I had read was there was one scenario where you took your 6 World War II Allied soldiers into, you had to attack an old castle that was being held by the Nazis. And one way to get into it was through the old dungeon. And Dave Arneson was like, let's make the Nazis orcs. And you're like Aragorn and Gimli and all that. And turned it into a D&D-like game where you dungeon crawl using fantasy wargaming using the wargaming rules. So, and then that grew into chainmail, Gygax's Virgin did, and then they came together to make D&D. So it's just an accident of the fact that it came first from military recreation, and then when they decided to take it to a new genre, they decided to take it to fantasy because in the 1960s, I guess that just fit with what they were doing. You don't really have, I think a lot of the sci-fi stories weren't as troop-based You know, that's what's so nice about a lot of the fantasy story, like Tolkien at least, is you've got this little squad of people, the Fellowship. So that lends itself well to a group of friends playing it. The most science fiction of that period and big influential stuff of the 20th century didn't focus on like a squad of people, right? You just had like the Luke Skywalker. I mean, maybe, you know, you've got Luke and Han and Leia and Chewie in the Falcon, but that wasn't out yet when Gygax and Artisan were doing their thing. So, which is a fancy long way to say, yeah, it's because it was first.
Yeah. Well, is there something that fantasy offers that is more universal, perhaps a storytelling trope, or even as a narrative element that resonates more with TTRPG players, even yourselves, than other genres? Like, do other things do they resonate with you as much as fantasy?
For me
I can't say.
personally, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. For me personally, I find fantasy is just really broad, and I can do pretty much anything I want with it. And when I think of sci-fi, or more futuristic things, even modern things, it tends to be very setting specific. Like this is a Star Wars thing. This is a Cyberpunk thing. This is a Dune thing. It feels a little more constraining to me because it's not as blended together as general fantasy magic stuff is.
I mean, I can play fantasy, come up with stories for fantasy, but I like even though in a setting, but let's use Star Wars as an example, which is setting in a game I love. I love playing Star Wars role playing games. I can still come up with great stories with Star Wars, even though I'm stuck to a setting, you know. And I'll be very honest with you, but my type of games are very black and white. It's, you know, evil people here, good people here, and people are fighting the evil people. And I do that with fantasy, and I obviously you could do that with Star Wars. I mean, that's what Star Wars is. It's a very black and white setting. So I don't feel like fantasy and necessarily opens up my canvas for greater storytelling. I just think that fantasy as a whole feels so natural for role playing as a concept that it's almost like ingrained as something that just feels right, right? And I know that's kind of cheesy, but we're talking about 50 years old, years of playing a certain way in a certain setting with certain assumption, and it's kind of hard to beat that. You know, it's a I could launch a new genre today, role playing in 20th century Miami, and it's not going to be as fun as role playing in the Forgotten Realms. It's just not this thing, you know. And modern games exist, you know, D20 modern and that sort of thing. But there's a reason why fantasy keeps coming and keeps being accessible while other games and other genres aren't. It just feels right. It's like a comfy pair of jeans.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said for that. It's funny, we've been talking about sci-fi as the big alternative, but there's another genre that's been with role-playing games since the beginning almost, and that's superheroes, right? I mean, one of the first games I played in the early 80s, besides basic D&D, was like villains and vigilantes and stuff, right? Yeah. So, hey, self-plug, I wrote a game called S5E, Superheroic Roleplay for 5th edition. And something I said in that book, which I think applies here, is this. Normally in fantasy, the story in the books and the films are about a zero to hero story, right? It's like, it's just the unassuming hobbit, or it's, if you want to go to in a different fantasy series, like the Prydain series, he was an assistant pig keeper, right? Who became the great hero, right? So, I mean, that's just how those stories worked. There's growth over this path of the story, which lends itself to leveling up and the gamification parts. Whereas in superhero stories, for sure, that's not what happens. Usually the story opens and he's or she's or they are heroes, and then they have a challenge, they overcome, they react to the bad guys robbing the bank, and then at the end of each story it resets to the baseline. You have an arc and then you're back to the beginning. So it's almost, it lends itself well to one shots and short things, but it doesn't actually lend itself as well, naturally speaking, to longer campaigns, whereas fantasy is perfect for it. Now, sci-fi depends on what kind of story you want to tell. But I think that's one big challenge for modern gaming and modern settings, and superheroes as a genre, is the way we tell those stories are kind of differently structured than the way we tell fantasy.
Yeah, you're talking about episodic versus serial, and I do think fantasy can do either very well, but some other genres tend to do one better than the other. Horror, I think, is like superheroes. It tends to lend itself to very episodic content, which, you're right, does not create the leveling up dynamic that people love. People love leveling up. They love the idea of getting it bigger and better and whatever. Although I haven't had one go, I want to be the best linguist in the universe. But maybe. I'm sure somebody's done it.
I also think there's something to be said for games that are fun. And for me, if I want to play a genre outside of fantasy, or let me take a step back. So for me, D&D as a system, as a gaming rules system, works well with fantasy. I'm not so sure I enjoy the D&D rule set when applied to a different genre than fantasy. And I've experienced it. Star Wars, for example, Wizards of the Coast put out their D20 version. I hated it, even though I love Star Wars. So what I'm getting at is that if there's a genre that has a good system attached that sort of fits the genre, then that makes it fun. Someone who's doing that really well is what's the company, the folks that put out Forbidden Lands and From the Loop.
Free League. Tales from the
Free
Loop.
League.
Free League, correct. Put out all sorts of different genres, but their system is so much fun and they customize the system so well to the different genres. It feels fresh every time you try it out.
Yeah, I think there are two
It
companies.
doesn't feel like a tacked on.
3 companies that do that very well. I think Cypher does that well. I think Free League does that well. I think from the Apocalypse.
Powered by the Apocalypse?
Powered by the Apocalypse. There's a lot of games like that really customize around that very well. So I guess it would be Evil Hat and the people who attach to that. But yeah, I think you're right. D&D has had so much time to mature into the mass of the setting, because it is just a massive type of setting, regardless of Forgotten Realms. I mean, just everywhere, everything is a setting for it. I'm going to bring up a screen real quick that I thought was very interesting when I was researching for this. So I was looking at the most competitive fiction categories on Amazon, and it has not always been like that, but that is current. So fantasy is number 1. It means there's the most authors putting the most content into that category. What I find interesting, though, is you could almost say that all of the other ones are the competition to fantasy. First off, I wonder whether this leads to, these are fantasy book authors or story authors. Does that lead to more fantasy game creators? I don't know whether that is necessarily correlated. But I do know that it means that there's a larger amount of interest in the category as a whole in the wider picture of things. But then could science fiction, dystopian, adventure, romance, detective, and mystery. By the way, there is a romance game out this year that I want to play so bad. Passion de la Passion, or something like that. Oh my God, I couldn't believe that somebody did it.
The soap opera.
Yes, the soap opera game. the novellas game. What? I almost have to do it now just because it's just so odd. What an odd thing to see. Horror, thriller. I was actually surprised horror was so low. So I look at that and I'm wondering, could the collective numbers of these other things over time, do a death by 1,000 cuts on fantasy and collectively reduce fantasy to say below 50% of the play of role-playing games. And to maybe lose that argument myself, I thought this was interesting too. This is from Roll20. Fantasy is 66% of the games played on Roll20. I don't know what it was in the past. Welcome, Jason. Thank you for joining us. Jason runs Shadowmane, awesome blog. Y'all should read their stuff. It's awesome. So I don't think 66% is so much that it's an unconquerable number with time and, the death by 1,000 cuts. Could fantasy drop below 50?
I think it could. I mean, it's just a matter of where the players are, what the players want.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also. Go ahead, Enrique.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, the thing with D&D is that you also have the power of Hasbro behind it, right? And that's a big thing behind anything. A lot of tabletop RPGs are small press operations fighting against a behemoth powered by a multinational corporation. I mean, that's a tough thing to compete against.
That's true. Speaking of giant multinational corporations, so I am going to get into the last 13 months. So we all remember. So we've seen a splintering in the industry in the last year. That is not even in question, I don't think. The question is where the splinters fall. So I'm going to go over a list of things that just off the top of my head that I thought, these all happened in 1 year. Did it have an effect on the market of genre, of fantasy as a genre? WotC harms creators with last year about this time with the open license debacle, right? This year, a month ago, they let off 1,000 people to terrible publicity. Critical Role introduces a game not built on WotC properties. MCDM kickstarts a fantasy game to the tune of $3+ million. Pathfinder cleanses itself of anything WotC. The Orc license is released. Cobalt Press releases Tales of the Valiant again, I guess. So in the short and long term, does that mean anything for the popularity of the world's greatest role-playing game by their own moniker? I don't think it is. And fantasy in general. Like, did it mean anything to the play? Or was, short and long term?
I think most of the ones you mentioned are still fantasy games.
Yeah, MCDM was. Well,
Candela
Roles
Obscura seems to be, from what I've heard of it, is just kind of, there's a lot of mystery involved.
I'm not sure I would call it fantasy. I guess it's very easy to put it under the big tent fantasy, but I don't know if I would call it fantasy in the classic sense. So,
but like Tales of the Valiant, that's basically, D&D without Wizards of the Coast. Pathfinder is D&D without Wizards of the Coast. These other ones is still fantasy. Although I've been spending more time online, I'm hearing more about games that are coming out, people are working on, which is nice because while I'm a fantasy D&D guy, there should be options for people, and I like that there's more science fiction stuff, more steampunk, more everything, horror games, although that to me sounds like it'd be a bit more difficult to run because you gotta like instill fear in people as a general thing. That just sounds harder for me to keep up with. But there are options for people who like different genres. And this Wizards of the Coast thing, I think, is contributing to the options that are available.
I think I would be willing to bet $10 or lunch with the three of you that if you were to sample a game store around the country, less than half the people, and I think I'm being generous, would know anything about the OGL debacle, care about the layoffs at WotC, would know or would be able to name 5 other games outside of D&D.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a tempest in a teacup, all of it. It's things that we who are involved in the industry know about, care about. But I mean, I think people I'm happy that there's Tales for the Valiant and the MCDM thing. Sure, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and $3 million is a lot of money. I mean, if somebody wants to give that to me, I'll take it. But compared to how much money, I mean, we're talking like billion with a Carl Sagan B, dollars they bring in, well, with Magic, but every year, it's like $400 million a year or something was the last number I heard from the shareholders report last year. And I mean, that's a lot of money every single year. And guess what? MCDM's not going to make $3 million on, at least on that game, probably ever again. That was it, So they now are going to be looking at this diminishing tail for the existence of that game. And that's it. I mean, they're lucky if they're making 2%, 5% maybe of what WotC makes year upon year upon year. We are in the margins. Even third-party D&D creators are compared to, like, I've got an adamantine seller on drive-through, and I'm very proud of it and happy. But it was nothing compared to the least popular and least successful WotC product. So
that's a name for a fantasy RPG: Diminishing Tales.
Right?
Gear up for adventure with Diminishing Tales.
Yeah.
Well, then let's
now
talk about
with more spreadsheets.
Yeah. So let's talk then about media, because D&D gets the press, right? It's in Stranger Things, Critical Role for a long time, and still, but not only. But then there are other licensed properties that are way bigger than D&D. Star Wars dwarfs D&D, yet the game itself has not blown up the game industry. So is there anything that can change that? Could it be, although I will say I've never seen an ad in Star Wars stuff for a Star Wars role-playing game. And I've always wondered that. Like, why are we not seeing these games being promoted? Probably because of the cost, but they don't get shouted out by the creators of Star Wars either. But maybe that's what is needed, is someone with just deep enough pockets and some smart social media or marketing strategy to break the curse of the other games.
If you allow me to spend moments talking Star Wars role-playing game, because I have a for Star Wars role-playing game. It boggles the mind. To me, Star Wars, more so than Dungeons and Dragons, is the perfect for role-playing games. Right? As kid, we all played with people my age played with action figures. We were in Solo, we were Walker. We were role-playing in this. We just didn't know it. We were playing with our action figures. How in the world this company, whether it's Fantasy Flight or whether it was West End Games back in the day, it's a different era. Let's stick with Fantasy Flight. The era of streaming, when you have access to music, you have access to Star Wars props, you have access to costumes, you have access to Star Wars art. How in the world Lucasfilm didn't work with Fantasy Flight to help promote, help push, and help develop this game so it would blow up? It could possibly blow up because it has all the tools showing up. How in the world that didn't happen, I don't understand. Have someone inside Lucasfilm, because one of the story group executives, Pablo Hidalgo, who is a exec, and he's in charge of he runs he's one of the big guys at the story group. He's in role-playing games. Like, he used to work for West End Games. He was a free for West End Games. He started in games. Like, he should be championing role-playing games company over and over. And he might be. I don't know that he is. I'm speculating. But how someone hasn't embraced the streaming side and marketing side of this? They know how to market like anybody's business. How they haven't done that for RPGs, I'll never understand. Never understand that.
I have a theory. Here's my theory.
Love to hear it.
The profit margin on role-playing games is so vanishingly thin that it's more profitable to throw the same amount of money at making video games. And there's a massively larger audience for them. So they'll make a lot more money making Star Wars video games and TV shows than they would role-playing games. There's just more people play or watch video games and TV. I mean, while we were talking, I looked it up. And just to give you an idea, everyone knows that just as D&D is like the 800-pound gorilla in the room for role-playing games, Critical Role is the 800-pound gorilla for streaming games.
Yeah.
Critical Role has about like 1.3 million viewers, like Twitch subscribers or whatever, YouTube. That's amazing. Stranger Things has more like 30 million. Just to give you, I mean, it's 30 times a larger audience. And video games make more money than TV and movies in America. So it's probably video games make a lot more money, I'm guessing, than role-playing games. That would be my guess why. Capitalism.
So then the other question is, could WotC end up strangling itself by moving to video game production primarily and handing off or even just neglecting the role-playing game market? And if they did, would their just existence still in the market allow them to continue dominating? Because I can totally see them neglecting it for video games. Baldur's Gate 3 was, potentially the model.
I think they are. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I think they seem to be treating D&D as more of a brand than a game. It started as a game, but people know it for fantasy, there's been so many D&D games licensed over the years, starting with TSR and then Wizards of the Coast. And that is a lot of people's exposure to the game is through the video games. Like, they know that it's a different game, but they're video gamers. And I could see Wizards of the Coast investing a lot more in games. But so far, as far as I know, all of their stuff has been licensing the name and some of the IP to video game companies, and then Wizards of the Coast just making a cut. They're not like actually doing the real investing in it. So they might just, they've got the movies, they've got, all this other stuff tying into it as a brand. I don't see them entirely like abandoning like the game of the role-playing game. But I can see them, still diversifying just to capitalize on that name that's been around for 50 years now.
Yeah. Do you think that... So this goes back to, I guess, the old game style. Do you think that game stores do an adequate or a poor job of promoting other games, systems, and settings? Or do they just rely on walk-ins and D&D?
I don't think it behooves a game store to promote another game other than the 300-pound gorilla. Because the 300-pound gorilla will sell them 20 copies. The other does one copy. That's just my opinion. And I don't know anything about the game store business. I'm just speculating it. But I believe if I owned a game store, I'm going to push D&D as hard as I can, only because it's the big player who's probably going to bring the most eyeballs to the store.
Yeah. Actually, Sprig said something that I thought was interesting a little bit further up in the chat. He said, you have over 100 video game streamers that do over 10 million. So that number, and that means there are 10 of them that are 10 times bigger than Critical Role.
100.
Yeah. So, we are talking about the idea that our gaming niche, tabletop, is so much smaller than video games, and I'm sure way less profitable when both are succeeding. I think you can lose a lot more money in video games, but when you succeed, it blows the top off businesses. So I think there's real benefit there.
Sure, but if you're a business that is not involved in anything other than top games. So, for example, Fantasy Flight Games, right? They own a Wars license, or they used to. They got rid of it recently. Edge Studios, which I think it might be a spinoff of Fantasy. But regardless, you own the Star Wars license, pay a huge amount of money for that license, right? Because that license, I imagine, is not a cheap license to own. You're probably paying, or it's in your best interest to try to get something in that contract that the license holder has to help you promote your game and has to help you grow this brand or grow this game, right? Like an article in StarWars.com isn't anything shouldn't be something that be one special stream of maybe with a cast of rebels, let's say, or whatever. I don't know. I'm inventing is some doable. I mean, these aren't things that are impossible to do. It surprises me that they're not done more often.
Yeah.
Because a company like Fantasy Flight that has no video games that has no brand waffle makers like D&D does, to rely on and sense out. They live this stuff. They got to help push it as much as possible. What I'm saying?
Right. So the three of you create things for this particular game. What would be needed for you to feel like it would be worth your time and effort to create for a non-fantasy game? Like what would be needed to lure you? All three have been creating for a while now. Actually, I think, Gwen, you're the one who's been creating the least time. So I know that there's a bigger, heavier, like Nathan's got just a massive content library of material for fantasy. So, maybe what I'm getting at is perhaps the creators are already so invested, it's not worth it to try and pivot to something else, even with the WotC stuff that happened last year. And I don't mean the biggest, because Pathfinder, they did some pivot, but I mean, really, it wasn't that much.
I mean, I actually published outside of D&D first. I did something for World of Darkness, and I did 2 or 3 Savage Worlds things. I mean, the sales are minuscule.
Yeah.
It's just the sales aren't there. I mean, when you look at like Cypher Unlimited and all those other, the Miskatonic thing for Call of Cthulhu is the second largest role-playing game in the market by Roll20 numbers, for example. But it's still just the time invested to make that product. You're going to get like 1/20th the sales. So, I mean, if you do it out of love, sure, but not for money.
For me personally, I guess I like sci-fi stuff. I love sci-fi movies and TV shows and stuff, and I've played, Star Wars video games and, love that stuff. I guess just the way my brain works, I've also got the huge interest in swords and sorcery and dragons and stuff like that. So the creative part of me just kind of like leans towards fantasy, whereas the sci-fi or modern stuff is just more entertainment for me. So if I don't know if, I got involved in a game as a player in a different genre and got really invested in it, I might get more creative with that and switch to making stuff for that. But it's not really what I play. So as a player for imaginative stuff, making a brand new stuff, that's where fantasy sticks for me versus, switching to a different genre. I'd need to be creatively invested in it.
The biggest product I ever sold, and I haven't published a whole lot. The biggest product I ever sold was a niche product I created for kids. It was a game aimed at 4 and 5-year-old kids to get them stood in the hobby. The reason I did is because at the time when I first created it, I had a little girl. She was 4 years old, and I was playing 4E D&D at the time. D&D had just come out with the 4th edition. I'm talking about 2009 or so. And she was very curious about what I was doing. And I said, let me do something with her. And I created this little game for her. And I said, I think people might like this. And I sold it. And it's a product called RPG Kids. It's a mid-roll seller on drive-thru. It did really well. I mean, for the scale of what we're talking about, right? It sold really well. But the reason I think is because there was a niche. It was a niche product. Parents who wanted to game with kids. And I think in all aspects, if you can find a niche being served or isn't being served or in a specific way that audiences might latch onto, I think you have a shot. You're not going to do WotC numbers, obviously, but you don't have to do WotC numbers, right? None of us are competing against Hasbro, global market space here, right? We're mostly all, I mean, I don't want to speak for any of you, but I don't live off of, the stuff I publish for. They're side gigs, and you could have a really nice side gig, like Mike Shea, my friend Mike, Sly Flourish, Mike has turned his D&D content almost a career. Great for him. And then you have guys like, people like me that, do it for a couple bucks here or there, and we're okay with that. I think it's all about finding your niche, something that's fun, that you enjoy. You can't get into something, this is my personal belief, you can't get into doing something that you don't personally enjoy, like you said, because then it's a non-starter.
So then what about other fantasy games? Because none of them have taken over or gained, I would say, a reasonably large market share. I mean, there's some really impressive pieces that have come out for fantasy. Tolas is just a massively impressive piece. I don't think it's taken over anywhere. Tales from the Valiant, maybe that'll do well, but will it do? It won't do D&D well, will it? I mean, I'm assuming no. Free League's game, their fantasy game that they just
Forbidden Lands.
Forbidden Lands, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of amazing fantasy games, and within that market share, I would wonder if they collectively could get to 20% of fantasy games, like these bigger name games.
I mean, again, you're competing against Hasbro, and that's just such a big obstacle. It's such a big hurdle. This isn't Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. I mean, these are can pay Paramount to, they can work with Paramount on a movie. I mean, we're talking, it's a different scale. I think the question to ask is, can a company like Tales of the Valiant compete with a Pathfinder, ISO? Can they compete with a, to me, those are I think D&D sits in a different category, and everything D&D should be the benchmark to hit. Because I don't think you can catch up to D&D, because I just don't think it's possible given the scale. Personally, I may be wrong, but
I mean,
I think collectively these other games could, eventually, hit 20% of the market. Individually, no, because D&D has the name recognition, because it was like the first one, really, and it's got the players. What do you play? Oh, I play D&D. You want to play D&D? Yeah. You want to play Pathfinder? Oh, I've heard of that one. Sure, let's try it. You know, let's play Tales of the Valiant. What's that? It's
It's
where
like
the players
Kleenex.
are.
Well,
It's
you
it's the
could
name.
say, let's play the
It's the
One
name
Ring.
recognition.
You could say, let's play the One Ring, and that would have, that recognition.
Possibly, but
But
not. I mean, not as a game for me. It as a setting, some stories. Um, yeah, but I don't immediately think of, like a role-playing game when I
So,
hear that.
so what about these other games? Okay, and there's one mentioned. There are a bunch just mentioned by Jason, and I already had those and others in my list, like Traveler or Alien, Call of Cthulhu, Blades in the Dark. Like these are all, although Blades in the Dark, is fantasy, but I almost feel like D&D itself is not the same market. Like it is an untouchable market. And is that a healthy thing for the ecosystem of role-playing games, for there to be honestly two markets, two separate markets, one for the niche products or the smaller products, and there's D&D. And is that good for players? I mean, everybody comes in through D&D just about. So
I think if the people that have had $1 million Kickstarters, they'll tell you, yeah, it's perfect. We're okay. And there's quite a few of those, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's not just a few.
yeah.
So I think you could live comfortably without having about D&D as a competitor.
Yeah, I've seen some very
Or without trying to reach D&D numbers, I should say.
I think D&D makes a good introductory game too. There's, other games have different mechanics and different levels of technicality. D&D is the big introduction for so many people to role-playing games. Then they get introduced to other games. They start to hear about them because they're involved with D&D as a role-playing game. They start to hear about these other role-playing games and they want to try it out. So I don't think it's necessarily bad to have a game with such recognition that D&D does for all these other games. But I think, getting the names of them out there, getting them just the name recognition is the hardest part for them.
I think that is a big deal, but there are a couple ways that is happening already. In the last couple of years, we've seen Alien drop, Blade Runner drop, and I've seen, this is something that I think Cypher does really interestingly. They take popular podcasts and kickstart them into games. They did it with Old Gods of Appalachia, Magnus Archives, two multi-million-dollar releases, and I found that very interesting. That they honestly, I was wondering whether they were the first to recognize that these storytelling podcasts had so much store game telling value, or others just don't know how to do it or not. Maybe they found a niche nobody had thought of. But I found that very interesting. And they come in with name recognition. Same thing with Star Wars. Star Wars walks in with massive recognition. My Little Pony could come in with massive recognition. I think it actually did. I think there is a My Little Pony game. So there's value in that, but it still doesn't seem to do anything as far as market share. It always seems to stay relatively small. Even the biggest of them, Alien, Star Wars, Blade Runner. I mean, Star Wars is the biggest of the three, probably. I'm going to assume.
Look at Marvel Comics. They just put out a Marvel Comics game. It's self-published at Disney. I'd love to see what sales, what kind of sales that. I don't know if there's a lot of marketing behind it. The only marketing I've seen is on Twitter, but I haven't read comics in a while. Maybe they advertise inside of comics. I don't know. But that's a brand. That's a global brand that does $1 billion movies every time they put out a movie. I'd love to see what Book is doing. That's an interesting case. Big property. Except well outside of the tabletop space in movies and print, TV. So how does it do in the tabletop? I think it'd be a great case study to look at the Marvel game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I bet I don't know. I have no idea, but I can tell you that I don't know, 5 years ago maybe, to get the license to do a role-playing game that used Marvel or DC or something like that, not in-house by by Disney, but like as a third party, was like $50,000 or something, and they get a large cut of your profit. I mean, it was a lot of money, and it's hard to make those profitable, even if you sell a ton of books.
Yeah.
So
Maybe
that's
books is not the way. Maybe we need to get to a point where it's post-book tabletop role-playing games. That's a
well.
scary thing to say, but maybe
I mean,
that is.
do you think that digital VTT stuff will just keep video gamifying and video gamifying? And I mean,
I don't know.
playing Baldur's Gate is
Good
not
question.
that radically different than what some people were trying to do with using digital tools to make role-playing games. But I don't know.
I also think I went to the store the other day with my son. I went to Barnes and Noble. There's a Barnes and Noble near my. I went to Barnes and Noble the other day, and I'm looking in the role playing. It's a very small section. It's basically a corner of the store, right? And where they had the Marvel book, right? So if I'm Marvel, I'm putting this book in the role playing section. I'm putting this book where the comic paperbacks are, where the trade books are, because that's where the bigger audience is. There's more people going over to the next wall than there are coming to this little corner of the store here to role playing books, and it's sort of lost in the clutter here. This book belongs with a comic book, so that a comic books fan sees it and says, "Wait a minute, what's this? You could play a Spider-Man? Oh, interesting." Instead of advertising to people like me that might see the book and say, okay, well, I played Marvel in 5 other systems. What does this one do?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think maybe it's a whole situation where they're not marketing these things properly and placing them on the right places in stores,
I mean, perfect example was at Gen Con last year. It came out right the week before, I think, or like you could get your hands on physical copies at Gen Con for one of the first times. And I remember being stunned that they had contracted with some company to do the table at Gen Con, and the people who were in charge of marketing booked a tiny little middle of the row booth that you couldn't even find, and it didn't have there's not big signage. Like, it's Marvel. They could have afforded to buy out half the floor if they wanted, but it was honestly pathetic. I mean, you go down to like just, I don't know, Dungeon Crawl Classics, or Goodman or Kobold Press, or one of those has that whole end of the row spread with standees and big emblazoned banners. Where was Marvel? They were in his tiny little side booth in a corner somewhere. So they were not spending money on marketing at Gen Con.
Yeah, that tells you how much they saw the potential in it, and their marketing budget was, a social media person, one trade show, and you get a pop-up banner. Like, that's it. Well, we're about midway through. I'm going to come back with a challenge to the idea that it is unable to take fantasy down. It's a long shot one, but it is one that I think is potentially there. We'll be back in a few minutes, everybody. Enjoy a few clips from Old Gods of Appalachia. By the way, I want to say thank you I got my Lock and Rail map, which I'm super excited about, for my Old Gods of Appalachia game. So that's super awesome. It came in yesterday. See you in a few minutes, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. Get my hat on. I don't like to be without my hat anymore. So I'm going to bring up a screen. I was doing a little research, and I found something that I thought, oh, that's intriguing. It may mean something, it may not mean something. So let me bring it up. I don't know if you can read that very well. Man, that seems tiny. I wonder if I can make it a little bigger and just not cover too much. So these are the and this is just for drive-through, the best-selling TTRPGs on drive-through in 2022 and 2023. The legitimacy of this list, I don't know. It's something I found on a site that was discussing, the sales of TTRPGs. So in 2022, the number of fantasy releases that was in this list was 18. But in 2023, the number was 12. And horror had the biggest jump from 0 to 6. Sci-fi went up from 2 to 3. Mystery went up from 0 to 4. And other it went down 1 from 4 to 3. So do you think there's a chance that maybe ignoring D&D might be what the new players are doing coming in, or I would say not being as engaged by D&D, but are more engaged by TTRPG as a whole and are experimenting with different kinds of games and systems and settings? And potentially it could be because of things like access via Roll20 or the big VTTs. Like there's a lot more games, and even things like RPG Match, where you have opportunities to match your games. They tell you what games they have available, and you can go through and list them.
Well, I mean, a couple things. One, looking at drive-through RPG sales. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons isn't sold on drive-through RPG.
Yep.
Not the Wizards of the Coast content, only third-party OGL stuff.
Yes.
So I don't know if I could conclude anything about changing engagement levels with D&D based on that. You might say something like, there's kind of like Enrique was saying before break, there's D&D is in a different realm, and then there's the rest of us down here. And it might be the case that there's a growing shift away from classic D&D style fantasy to other genres. Maybe. I mean, I don't know if this shows that, but it could be the case. It is the case, I think. I mean, I've only been in the industry since about 2017, but I've been, a player since the 80s, and it does seem like in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years, 5 or 10 years, that Call of Cthulhu has kind of had a big resurgence. And so, like, if you had looked at, asked somebody, well, what's the number 2 role-playing game 10 years ago, I think most people would have said Pathfinder. But now it's by far Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is like 10% of Roll20 games right now. And Pathfinder is like 2%.
So I find that very interesting because I think there's a generational divide between VTT players and those that aren't. I mean, obviously there's some crossover. I'm an older player, but I love playing on stream. And that was kind of my point, was maybe there's a generational change that we're just beginning to feel because of the access of everybody in the world playing every game in the world. That might make it
take a
decade to shift,
yeah.
Or 2 decades to shift, or whatever it is.
Mm.
Go ahead, Gwen.
I just talked. Go ahead. You can have a go.
I think, we were talking about, the OGL thing, and I think that's exposed a lot of people for like a lot of these lesser known titles, but also getting people to DMs, especially GMs, to look at other systems, and that exposes players to other systems, other genres. And that might be a contribution to that shift just from 2022 to 2023, as people going, well, Wizards of the Coast sucks. Let's look at other games. And all these other games are out there with other genres for people to try. And I think it's an exposure thing, and GMs exposing their players to it, actually doing the research, looking online, what else is available.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing, because it exposes more people to more genres, more possibilities, can lead to more other games other than fantasy. And I think that's a great thing. Fantasy will always be there. It may not always dominate the way it does now in the future. We don't know for sure. But having those options there, it's nice to see a shift in availability.
Oh, Enrique, you're muted.
Ah, thank you.
I apologize for that.
No
It,
problem.
it feels to me at times that the industry is almost not interested in marketing to anything else other than the audience for tabletop RPGs. And I'll give you an example of that. There are a few books that came out, role playing game books, based on hit movie from the 80s. It's like there's like a Transformers RPG, there's a G.I. Joe RPG, there's an Escape from New York RPG, there is a, I want to say, the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, maybe Commando or something. Maybe inventing that right now, but there's a few books that came out based on 80s properties. I guarantee you, don't play RPGs probably have no idea these things exist. Yeah. And even people who play RPGs might not know these things exist. A lot of people who play RPGs only know D&D, and that's all they know, or anything else.
Yeah.
It's D&D, and what do you mean there's another game? There's D&D. That's telling, because these are big name properties. I mean, if I tell you that there's a G.I. Joe RPG, G.I. Joe has a huge fandom. Yeah. Masters of the Universe has a huge fandom out there. People watch the show on Netflix, dying to collect the games, the action figures. And I'm sure that if there was a role-playing game for Masters of the Universe, that at least sample. They'd at least open the book and say, okay, let me check it out because I love Masters of the Universe. But the information doesn't go beyond the walls of the walled garden that people who play role-playing games and people who are active online and people who know these things exist. And it's a huge problem because the industry is shooting itself in the foot. And they're leaving money on the table. And if they don't get past that, I don't see how much growth will be. But, you know.
I mean, so a couple things I want to add in here. So first, it reminded me what you were saying, Enrique. I've seen a meme of, there's like a picture one has a guy very excited, and it says when TMNT fans back the Kickstarter for the TMNT RPG, and then the next picture is him going, what? Like he's really disappointed and confused, and that's when he gets his book and opens it, right? And that's, I mean, I have a pet theory again about this, which is that role-playing games are marketing to role-playing game players because role-playing games are by their very nature, as the culture of it now, inaccessible. Like role-playing games just have a bigger version of the same problem that board games have, right? You ask somebody some normie off the street about what board games do they like, and they'll say things like Monopoly, Scrabble, maybe. They won't
Scrabble,
say,
I'd be super excited if someone ever said that.
right? You're like, oh wow, you're a real serious board gamer. They won't say Wingspan or Twilight Imperium or even like a family-friendly game like Carcassonne or Ticket to Ride. Those games are like orders of magnitude smaller and more complicated in many cases than things like Monopoly. So like the board game industry has this problem too, where it's like if they want to grow, they have to simplify their games and streamline the heck out of them, but they're going to lose a lot of their existing audience who wants more complicated games and richer games. And I think role-playing games has that problem too. And so I'm really happy that D&D has been, at least with 5th edition, trending towards somewhat simplified rules, because I do think that makes the game more accessible to newer players. But it's still, I mean, that is not none of these starter sets, the player's handbook, none of those books. You better have a guide with you to get through that thing if you've never played a role-playing game before, because who wants to sit down and read that? It's like sitting down and reading a technical manual, right?
Yeah.
So that's a big issue. And then I think with regards to, Roll20 is like the Wild West right now a little bit. Any game can get up there, and if you get lucky and it takes off, build a little community, blah, blah, blah. And you might think if this just keeps happening in 20 years, the young kids who grew up on whatever Roll20 are gonna not play D&D. Well, there's a problem, which is that Wizards of the Coast is developing their own VTT. And if they ever figure out how to digitally market and monetize their content like they failed to do with whatever the fourth edition version. I forget what that was called, D&D Experience. What was that? They wanted to have it like an online, like a early VTT, and it bombed. And they're trying to build one with D&D Beyond. In fact, I actually got to run an early beta. Let's call it an alpha of the D&D VTT. And it feels like if it works well, I mean, imagine if you're playing Baldur's Gate, but instead of moving characters around, it literally looks like a mini that you pick up and move.
Yeah.
So it has a slightly more board gamey feel, and the rules are slightly more transparent. Like when you're moving during battle, it'll like the little number of feet is being counted off as you're moving. But that's what they're going for, right? And if they can ever pull that off and have a really smooth, easy to access, and pretty interface, then they'll be in the VTT space as dominant as they are in the print, in the regular role-playing game space. My kids, when they saw the preview video that was released on YouTube last summer of the D&D VTT, my 14-year-old, who I cannot get to sit down and play role-playing games with me anymore, he only wants to play video games, saw it and he's like, oh, I'd play that. So,
which, by the way, it's funny to me because when 5th edition launched, it was supposed to be theater of the mind and not miniatures, not a minis game. And the minute they can make money off a virtual table, that all goes out the window.
Yeah, I think that was a disconnect between the game development people in WotC and the game administration of WotC.
And never mind that the game itself, the rules, the underlying chassis of the game, obviously it's built for men.
Yeah,
I don't believe for a second that it's not. Never was.
Well,
but the marketing sure seemed to think it was.
Yeah. And what you're talking about are the gateways people use to get into the game, into the market. So the gateways, when all of us were growing up, were only tabletop, and we probably also came in. I'm going to guess we've all done some wargaming and some more complicated board gaming like Avalon Hill games and things like that were pretty detailed, like Gwen was saying, like technical manual kind of games. So there was a certain level of intellectual curiosity about complex systems you kind of had to have. But a lot of the games, the newer games, and I'm going to throw out Brindlewood Bay, for instance, a pretty simple game, simple premise. Is it a good gateway into other games? Like, do other games create? I don't think D&D is a good starter game. I think it's a very complicated, hard starter game, unless a GM goes, "Here's a character sheet, just roll the dice when I tell you." But you could potentially do that with any game, right? So, if you create the VTT that you're talking about, the experience, it could obfuscate the rules where people don't play it knowing the rules anymore. They play it actively playing it like a video game where they're kind of learn all the rules as they go a little bit here and there and until they stop dying every time. So
that's the way I introduce new players as the basics. And I think with role-playing games, people are used to like video game character creation. They get to choose options. And as they level up, they get to choose more options. So I don't think it's as difficult to pick up as it may have been in the past. And also, games mechanics are getting a little more simplified and easier to pick up in the first place. So even if you jump to other systems that are more sci-fi based, people still have that, a lot of people have that baseline experience of character creation in video games, computer games.
I think we also have, if you go back to the 80s, we also have 40 years worth of culture that has basically taught people what fantasy and D&D and these type of things and sets are, right? So like as a kid, I grew up in Puerto Rico. I had no idea what Tolkien was. I never read Tolkien. I had no fantasy anything. I didn't know what a dwarf was. I had no idea what an elf was. Somebody gave me, I'll never forget this. Somebody gifted us, my brother and I gifted us a red box, the old Beckney red box. And I found the idea, as I read, intriguing, but I had no idea what I was reading.
Right, me either. When I first, that's how I got it.
Yeah, and I don't mean language-wise. Like I spoke English to school where we were taught in English, but I literally had no idea what this was. I didn't know what an elf was supposed to be. I didn't know what a dwarf was supposed to be. I had no knowledge of this stuff, and it wasn't until I got into high school. Once here, living in the States here, that I got into high school and I started playing first edition D&D. And I had happened to have read it wasn't in Tolkien, I read Dragonlance, the original Dragonlance trilogy, and that was my gateway to fantasy.
Yeah. And
now I could at least picture in my head what a dwarf was supposed to be. And suddenly all my dwarves were acting like the dwarf from Dragonlance because that's all I knew, right? All my elves were elven because that's all I knew. I didn't really know anything else. I had no frame of reference for what fantasy was supposed to be. Now you can't really make that argument anymore. I mean, Lord of the Rings is everywhere. There's fantasy, there's a dime a dozen. It's a different world now, and the gateway is a lot easier to at least understand what it is you're getting into. You could tell a kid, okay, listen, you're fantasy world with dwarves and elves. They'll know what you're saying. Can't say that everybody back in the '80s had the same experience.
So is there a risk to the WotC hegemony potentially from a gateway that introduces people first to things other than D&D? Like maybe a company puts a lot of money into a VTT for everybody that is just as awesome as the D&D one or better, because we know that people can. There are computer programmers out there that can do amazing things, and maybe they can make it better, and maybe even sign up with the distributors of comics and games to distribute a gateway system for stores, physical stores. Like maybe there's a way of attacking the many vectors of gateways, which there's a zillion of them now, and even paying to get them in movies. Like, why did it have to be in Stranger Things D&D? It could have potentially been Pathfinder. If they were fans of Pathfinder, they may have said it. I don't think it would have hurt the popularity of Stranger Things, but it definitely would have helped the popularity of Pathfinder.
Well, with Stranger Things, I think it's set in the 80s, which, if you're looking for a big name game, was D&D. Big name nerdy game was D&D. I mean, it was in E.T.
Yeah.
But let's wait and see if Apple buys Disney, and if one day we'll see Apple develop a virtual tabletop for the Marvel game. That might be a different story. 100%. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I think it's going to take someone with big pockets to compete that way with D&D. I just don't see it happening any other way. Yeah. Not at the scale of global. You could say, well, under Roll20 is a smaller sample size than the sample size of all role players, right? Because even a Roll20 is a niche product that caters to, right? Let's be honest. It's not like people out in the street know what Roll20 is. If you don't really know games and you're not connected, you don't have no idea what Roll20 is. So it's going to take people with big pockets and big marketing money to take D&D off the throne. So, my opinion.
Yeah. And fantasy in general, you got to get the games. Well, like you were talking about how video games are such a big thing compared to role-playing games. Just exposing people to different genres of role-playing games, getting the names out there, that takes money for marketing. That's probably one of the biggest things is name recognition for anything. I don't have a lot of name recognition. I've been making stuff online for years, but I haven't marketed myself really. and I think it's the same way with these games of other genres. We hear about them because we're involved with role-playing games already. The general public is probably never considered, that Star Wars can be a tabletop role-playing game. They know it from video games, they know it from movies.
I'm going to give you another option, another way that maybe something could happen. I mean, I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks now. I had all these ideas. There are celebrities that know and understand what tabletop is. And I'm going to throw one out that I think is very interesting. And I've never seen games built on their properties. So Neil Gaiman, the author and creator of comics and novels, makes books that would make astoundingly good, I think, TTRPGs, but haven't. And he knows what TTRPGs are. I've heard him mention them in posts and stuff like that. So could an author like Stephen King or Neil Gaiman authorize a game that would create the opportunity to actually almost immediately take a big market share? Because that's what WotC did, I think, is they got Tolkien before, when it wasn't, without calling it Tolkien. That's what D&D did. So maybe a celebrity behind one of these things could actually bring a kind of clout that they've never seen in the industry like that.
Well, I mean, we have an example of that. The Expanse is a game based a series of novels that's also on a role playing campaign. So it's kind of like a role thing, right?
Yeah,
it started off as someone's home campaign for a game. They turned it into a novel series, and now they turned it into an event game. So yeah, I think you could. It's all about finding the right product, right?
Yeah.
You could argue TSR did that with Dragonlance, right?
That's true. Yeah, that's actually good. The Expanse was one I hadn't thought of, although that's a great example. I think if it was not in science fiction, maybe it would have had a better chance of cutting D&D down a little bit, but maybe not. I don't know.
But then you have to ask. How much money does Green Running have to put marketing? How much How much are they willing to push it beyond?
Yeah.
Push it now on the social media channels. It's all at the end of the day too. You got to worry about.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like asking, why can't small time creators challenge Apple on cell phones? I mean, like, there's just the infrastructures and they don't have access to it. So unless somebody wanted to come along and take a Green Ronin or a Kobold Press and say, here's $1 billion. I want you to turn Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere into the greatest role-playing game of all time. Okay, yeah, maybe they could. But in the absence of such a gigantic market-changing influx of capital, I mean, Neverwhere, and I mean, you could take everything that Neil Gaiman's ever done, and you would have less market reach than Star Wars or Marvel Cinematic Universe. And those things, we've seen that they don't challenge D&D. I mean, maybe if they were marketed better, or if they were written better, or something, but it's already happened.
So
it didn't do it.
To that, I'm going to offer up something that I think market forces almost always do, is they create 2 and occasionally 3 major players that all devour most of the market share. TTRPGs haven't really done that. It's one player and everyone else is devouring everyone else's market share. I mean, maybe they've eaten some of WotC's, but is there something that WotC has done that has prevented a second, like, where's their Google phones to the Apple phones in the industry? There isn't one that I've seen. Pathfinder 2 is not it at this moment. It's big, but it's not like that kind of big.
I mean, I think if you have properties that are big, like a Star Wars, and Star Wars, I'll agree here that it's a billions of dollar property, known around the world with fandom in every corner of the world, right? When you have properties like that haven't been able to even catch up a little bit to D&D, then what hope does anything else have? I mean, for real, like when you have a property like games. When you have a property like even really, they have Aliens, they have Blade Runner, they have licenses that are big names. Blade Runner is a cult classic and is still a huge property for 20th Century Fox Disney. I mean, they're making a movie now. When you have these types of properties and they haven't been able to dethrone D, then what chance does Path have if it's not among top players and this small niche of us who play these games? I think I just don't. It's there if you don't go after the wider group of people out there that don't play tabletop games, introduce them to tabletop games, because even the introductory sets, they're marketed at us. I'm marketed to other people. When D&D puts out an intro, they're marketing me. Like, guy, I've been playing D&D for 40 years. Come on, what are you doing? Don't market this at me.
So
I'm not the audience. I'll buy it, sure, because I'm a stupid collector. I'm a nerd, but come on, man. What are we doing?
So what about book publishers that are at a scale above WotC, the Rand McNally's or whoever these big publishers are, are they potentially someone who could go, you know what, we want to do tabletop and we know that they're making $1 billion a year or $400 million a year off this, and we're in an industry that is hurting and doing less. Could they bring that kind of financial muscle to bear and do it?
Well, Disney just put out a card game to compete with Magic. I don't know the name of the game. I don't remember it because I don't follow that market. But they're dipping their toes in it.
Lorcana.
Yeah.
My understanding is that the publishing industry right now, the print book publishing industry, is not doing well. It's actually contracting quite a bit.
Yep.
And so now is probably not the time that they would want to, or maybe it is. Maybe now's their chance. But again, if I'm a company that's looking for a new market to get into to make money, I mean, the joke. If you want to make $1 million in the tabletop role-playing game industry, start with $2 million.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know why anybody would want to come into an industry like this in order to make money, because again, the margins are so slim, and the way those licensing deals work with those big properties is they're not really designed to be very profitable for the producers of the actual role-playing games.
Yeah, that is true. They would have to do their own original property, and they'd have to put just massive money behind it to try and eat it. So that begs the question: is it healthy? Is it a healthy market that we're in?
If you're not looking to become the next WotC, you can make money in this industry. There's people doing it all the time. Look at Matt Colville. He's doing well. Green Ronin has been doing really well since they've left D&D behind. I think you could. I don't think you'll never see the number of WotC sees, but that's not through any fault of that's just because of who backs it. I mean, it's a different monster. But
yeah, I also
think
you could. I'll go. Sorry, go on.
No, I'm saying I think there is a way to make money and have a healthy business. You run it well and you're smart about it. Absolutely. I don't think you can compete with Wizards of the Coast, but that shouldn't be your goal.
I don't know if it's still true, but I remember a few years ago, somebody said that most of the people in the tabletop role-playing game space are part-timers. They do it as a hobby. They do it on the side. And that the number of full-time tabletop role-playing game designers, there's more professional astronauts than there are tabletop role-playing game designers in America. I mean, we're talking like 20 people maybe in the whole continent who draw a salary, and that's just what they do full time. I mean, and half of them work at, you got 4 or 5 of them at WotC. There's four or five designers at Paizo. But most of these other companies, there's one person, it's just 1 or 2 designers. Even Monty Cook, which is one of the top 5 biggest companies, they've got 3 people that design all their games, and there's not a lot of people that can even afford to do it full time. Yeah, you can make money, but you can't make career money doing it unless you're I mean, it's like, I mean, you could be like saying, what do you want to do for your career? How are you going to pay your bills? I'm going to become an astronaut. I mean, okay, some people do it. I'm not going to recommend that at the career fair.
Well, I think that the industry, I think Kickstarter makes almost all of its money from tabletop board games and role-playing games. Everything else is now the niche on there. So potentially Kickstart, if you are good at kickstarting things, you can pull in a living, I think, off role-playing. I just don't think you can. I don't think anybody goes in and just throws money into things anymore. They kickstart it to make sure that there's a market, and then build it out from there. But I do think most of them do it as a work of, a work of love, and hope that it kickstarts, and then it does sometimes.
You better deliver, because if you don't deliver, then that's it. That's the last Kickstarter you'll ever do.
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of people crash and burn on Kickstarter, especially in the tabletop. I mean, I go through a list of names, and I'm not going to do it because I'm not a jerk. There's a lot of people that have crashed and burned on Kickstarter.
Yeah.
So even that's a little.
That's why when I do my thing coming up here, it's going to be basically done except for printing. Because I've read those stories, and people, hey, they wait forever and then it never materializes, and I'm like, no, I'm gonna be 99.5% done.
I mean, I worked for 2C Gaming in most of 2022, and their business model was kickstart a product with just like a proof of concept sample done. And then once they get the money for the product, they take that from the Kickstarter, they take that and they hire their writers and their artists and layout and editor and then produce the book. And well, what was happening, like lots of other companies, is they would fall behind deadlines, or things would cost more than they had expected or whatever. So then it got to the point where it's like, well, we better kickstart another book so we have enough money to finish the previous book. Right. And then they kind of started falling behind. And then they had one or two Kickstarters that underperformed. So they laid everybody off and closed the business.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's hard to do that. And even when they hit all their numbers, nobody was making a lot of money.
I've also seen that sometimes, I don't say a lot, I don't know the numbers. Sometimes people kickstart and their numbers are not right. And because of it, they can't deliver. They hit printing snafu, didn't leave themselves a 5% buffer, and they went 3% over and couldn't afford $10,000 to finish printing. And it died on the vine because nobody's going to walk over and give you $5,000, but that $5,000 is all you needed. Shipping, actually, that was a good one. Jason mentioned shipping increases is deadly to game. Almost everybody underestimates the cost of shipping, especially if you're shipping around the world. Everything to Australia starts at $50 to ship. Goes up from there. Especially books that are heavy. It's an interesting dynamic. I think that we're in. Boy, this is a weird thing to say. Obviously, it's a hobby industry. We're doing better than maybe railroad trains and slot cars, right? But maybe we're not doing as good as car hobbyists that build all the custom stuff for people's cars. Maybe we're doing just as well. I don't know. But I think in any kind of a niche industry, you can make money if you treat it like a niche industry. We're definitely doing better than fax machines. I say that, and I'm sure there's somebody making fax machines and making a fortune selling to the government. Or the auto industry that still uses fax machines. So, maybe... So does that mean that we're potentially overstaffed for our market? In the niches, outside of WotC? Like too many people creating, not enough people buying?
I wonder how many products there are, and I've never done the count. How many products exist on Drive-Thru and on Itchy? I think there's another platform, but is it Itch.io or?
Yeah, Itch.io.
What's the total number of products out there?
I've read that 98% of the products on Drive-Thru never sell 50 products, 50 units.
believe that.
I think one of the problems is that it's a hobby that part of being a role-playing game dungeon master is creating content. And there's a lot of, I mean, all you got to do is go over to Reddit or, anywhere that people talk about role-playing games, and you've got people being like, I could do better than that. And then they put something they created for their home game up, and then they get the bright idea to slap it up on drive-through. And you get a lot of people that are willing to create content and put it out to market it and sell it just because they already have the content made for their home game or because they love it just for fun. And it's like what they're doing isn't sustainable, because if they were actually billing their own hours and paying themselves, it wouldn't, they even like even my product that sold whatever 10,000 copies on drive-through. I mean, okay, if I paid myself, I mean, it's a decent salary, I guess, but it's for a couple months, and then that's it. That was it. So, I mean, too many people do it for free. They're willing to do it for free. That's hard to make money doing it.
Yeah.
I think there's also another dynamic that I think we haven't mentioned here, but I think it's also important when it comes to a new game. If I buy a game, right, whatever game that is, let's use the X as an example, or Alien. I'm expected to find 5 or 6 people to come sit up to want to learn a new game and play it instead of what they play now that they like. And that in and of it, you do, scheduling a game session itself is hard with 5 adults these days. Trying to get 5 adults to schedule a game session, learn a new game that they may or may not like, is tough. It's a tough sell. And getting me to spend $50 on a game that I may end up on my shelf because my players will not want to play it is a tougher sell. And I think that's a big part. There's groups out there that love trying out new things and love trying out new games and are willing to do it. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to spend the $50. Somebody's got to take the time to learn the game and teach and deal with the fact that 2 or 3 in that group may not want to play it. And if 2 or 3 people in that game group don't want to play it, guess what? You're not playing. Simple as that. And that's a part of this whole conversation that we haven't even reached. That's important.
Yes, but I think that online play has eliminated a lot of that. This year, I'm running 8 different game systems, and every time I put out a casting call now, and none of them are D&D. The closest I'm playing is we're going to run a Shadow Dark game. None of them are D&D, and every time I put out a casting call for these niche products, I get 35 or 40 people that apply. But if I did it at my local game store, I would get 2. So if you limit yourself to just the game store that you go to, yes, D&D all you'll do is D&D, and occasionally you might be able to play Cthulhu or Alien or something like that. Like Delta Green, I know for last year was pretty popular with a lot of friends I knew that played local. So there's going to be some games like that. But I didn't know any of them that played any of these at the level that they play D&D. None of them. Everybody plays D&D. But online, when I'm streaming, I open up my play to the world, and suddenly I have plenty of players for any game I want to run, including the narrowest, nichiest games.
Yeah, that's true.
And I wonder if that is the risk to WotC, is that people start to, and I don't think WotC's ever going to be taken down, even though they're the man, they're not going to be taken down, but they have to know that people are finding other games now, and that the market for them is just, it's big. There's a lot of game manufacturers that are making really quality product, really high quality product with their own systems, some of them related, some unrelated to D&D. Esper Genesis is a D&D 5e product. WotC doesn't get a penny from it, and they make science fiction using 5e. Now, that may actually provide more benefit to WotC that is sort of a soft benefit that people learn another D&D based system and can fall into it. But maybe it also gets people, it's the soft way out of D&D, maybe out of fantasy into other systems. And super.
I don't know. I guess I'm just a pessimist about this. I just don't expect WotC. I think the numbers of who's playing which games and how many percentages are non-WotC or non-D&D or non-fantasy, they might fluctuate. And maybe in 50 years, in 20 years, I don't know about 50, those numbers of non-fantasy will creep up to 50%. Maybe, sure. But I'm skeptical that we're going to see major change until there's something happens to change the market forces that currently keep WotC in. I think role-playing games are too small a potato, so to speak, to draw attention of like antitrust or monopoly concerns. Because it is weird that WotC is. How do they dominate the market? Isn't that?
I think it's because they don't dominate a market. They're in the market of games.
Maybe.
Or book manufacturing, and they're not the biggest in either of those.
Yeah.
Well, Hasbro might be. I don't know. Is Hasbro the biggest game maker? I don't really know.
They're the biggest toy maker.
Okay, but there are other ones. Mattel makes board games and stuff, and like there are other. I just can't. I don't think the government would ever see them as a monopoly. I just don't think they would see it that way. We see it and we feel it because we're in it, but it's not a monopoly as far as I can tell. And like we showed, they're 66% of the fantasy games. That's. I think they're probably played more than that because that was online stuff, but. Even if they were 80%, 80% would be pushing monopoly status, I think, but not within a niche. I don't think they would. I don't think the government would care.
And I think they got a great boost with the onset of streaming. I think streaming was an unexpected thing that came out, and they were able to. It was lightning in a bottle for them, and they were able to capitalize, and it has helped them tremendously. Only because some third decided to play their game on it, caught on with people. Me personally, I don't watch a lot of streaming games. I don't really get it. The idea of want to play games, just it's not my thing. But obviously, it's somebody's thing because there are huge audiences for it. And I think that helped them tremendously market their game to a new generation that wasn't playing before. I do believe. So, if we're back in the 3rd edition, 4th edition days, we were talking about the death spiral of tabletop RPGs. And guys like Ryan Dancer were, saying that it was in a free fall and whatnot. And today, that couldn't be further from the truth. So I don't think the industry in itself is unhealthy. I think it's just everybody's a little bit more, but I still think that WotC is the biggest of them all. Just because of who they are, right? Yeah. But I think the industry is living a moment right now where you might get lucky and catch that line bottle that Critical Role caught and D&D caught. Because of it, what if Critical Role decides to play your game now? You might be looking at a different conversation then. You know what I mean? I don't know what the sales number for their Candela Obscura. I'm sure it's going to do okay by virtue of who they are and their audience. They seem to have a lower audience. It makes sense that they're going to get into publishing. Too, if I had 1 million people subscribe to my YouTube, like whatever, people will scoop it up. So.
Yeah, I'm a casual watcher of Critical Role. And I don't necessarily, I watch it, yeah, because they were doing D&D, but also because the people were entertaining. So like I don't watch people play video games, but those people are role playing. So that's if they were doing, like more of a sci-fi thing, I might get into it because it was entertaining. And then if they're playing a game that complements the storytelling or whatever that wasn't fantasy, I might look into it. I might give it a try. Like I said, with shifting genres earlier, that I gotta have an interest in the creative part of it. So that's what I'd be looking for in the future from these other new new games that are coming out. We're talking about Wizards of the Coast a lot, and they make D&D. Well, these other systems, they gotta get the interest in there. And I've caught glimpses of some streams and stuff that don't use it and don't do fantasy. They do more of the sci-fi-ish, which is nice. We just need more people to get into it to do that.
Yeah, it may be missing a critical mass of some kind, which we probably don't know what that number means. Do you think at this point in fantasy as a genre, do you think that Tolkien or D&D is more important to the genre now? Because a lot of people know D&D in numbers that might rival Tolkien stuff. I don't know that for sure, but I was thinking about that. Like, who is more important to fantasy as a genre now, D&D or Tolkien? Tolkien's a grandfather, of course.
My guess is it depends what you mean by D&D. So if you mean the D&D brand, ampersand, playing the role-playing games, rolling D20s, whatever, then Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, by far, right? If you mean, think of the movies, think of it, there's an Amazon Prime show.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more people know about
Yeah.
hobbits than they do halflings, just to give you an example.
Yeah.
But if you mean the legacy that they've caused, because here's something about D&D that people don't often think about. For example, the Japanese designers of games, the games like the first Final Fantasy video game, we're playing D&D, and they wanted to recreate that experience in a video game. So like those sorts of early fantasy video games use the whole idea of like levels, and you've got the mage and the fighter and the thief and the cleric and all that. And now it is second nature. Most people who play video games are familiar with the idea of making a character, leveling up, choosing a class, casting spells, all this stuff. And that's much bigger than Tolkien.
Interesting. I didn't know where that question would go.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think I don't think you need Tolkien. You need to have knowledge of Tolkien to know fantasy these days. I think fantasy has become just another genre that's sort of out there and people know.
Yeah, Tolkien wasn't my first fantasy stuff.
Yeah, me neither.
Well, that's interesting. Do you? Oh, we're down to the last few minutes. So, all right. So, do you know people that will only play D&D and will never play another game? And at this point,
yeah.
right now, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we may have known a lot of people. Do you still know a lot that will only ever play D&D?
Listen, my home group. So we've been playing together for many years, right? Mm-hmm. 4th edition ends. I'm sorry. 4th edition launches. We play 4th edition. We tired of 4th edition because the combat dragged. We felt it was more of a board game tactical thing. We weren't really interested in that. So we switched over to Dragon Age by Green Ronin, which was a fantastic role game. We loved it. And then we did that for a little bit. And then 5th edition launched and we moved over to 5th edition. But I've tried my group to try Shadows of the Demon Lord. I've done everything in my power to get these people to pick up the book because it's such a good game and it's so well designed and it's so much fun, and I not get them to even look at it, right? And now there's a new one coming out, Shadow of the Weird Wizard, which is kind of like a high fantasy version of Demon Lord. And I'm hoping to God I can get them to at least read it. The character creation and the character progression and the whole thing in that game is so well done that I'm hoping. But the answer to your question, at least from my point of view, is absolutely. I cannot get people to play anything other than we play the occasional Star Wars only because we love the West games, D6 Star Wars. But other than that, we're stuck with D&D.
What about the other two?
I do D&D stuff. I've done it for 30 years. I might be one of those people who's just D&D, but then again, it could also be my personal version of D&D because I've, home house ruled stuff, homebrewed stuff. So I've kind of made D&D fantasy my game. Um, and I'm sure there's so many other people who have done that. I'd be open to playing other games if somebody's gonna run it and I get invested in it. Um,
Yeah.
so it's a possibility that, I might be one of those D&D forever people, but I'm not stubborn about it. I just haven't really clicked on anything else the way I have with fantasy and D&D.
Right.
And then I'm on the other end of the spectrum where yes, I probably played more D&D more than anything else, but more than half of my play maybe is not D&D, right? I play even with my kids, like I'll play Savage Worlds or something else, or Cypher SYstem. And with friends, I'll play, uh, World of Darkness or Powered by the Apocalypse or Gumshoe. I ran Trail of
Cool.
Cthulhu not that long ago for some my and this is like my group of I went to high school and we played role playing games together, and I got the band back together in 2014 when 5th edition came out, and we just played D&D for 5 years. But then I got them to commit to playing, and now one of the other guys runs old school Renaissance sometimes stuff, OSE or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nice.
which is D&D related clearly, but
Yeah. That's very cool. I mean, I don't want to be saying that I'm anti-fantasy. I'm not anti-fantasy. I'm just exploring now, and I want to play other stuff. But I know I will forever play D&D 2. I just wanted to take a year off and play all these other things I've backed Kickstarters of and try some other stuff. And like Enrique was saying, like, you buy these things and nobody can play. You can't play them. You need them.
well,
So
I know a great superhero game you could play. Oh, actually, Shadow of the Demon Lord is awesome.
yes.
I definitely back that one.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you in chat. Jason, you're amazing in there. You always have comments that both make me laugh and make me think. And that is the best thing to see in chat all day. It was great seeing Cypher Unlimited join us in chat. Let's go around, let everybody say who they are, where they can be found. Why don't we start with you, Nathan?
Sure. I am Nathan. Online, you'll find me as the Amethyst Dragon. I make D&D homebrew stuff. I'm currently creating it at amethyst-dragon.com. I'm also currently creating a giant 5th edition source book with everything for players and DMs. I'm currently halfway through editing it. It's all written, and it is 565 pages at the moment. That'll be kickstarting in mid-March. Anything you'll find, I'm at the Amethyst Dragon everywhere, or at Amethyst Dragon, Twitter at amethyst-dragon.com, on Blue Sky. It's there in the chat.
Yeah.
But you'll find me amethyst-dragon.com.
Yeah. And Gwen.
I'm Gwen Marshall. You can find me on all the socials at Dr. Gwen Marshall. I guess I didn't mention it before, but I will drop it in chat. I guess the most recent thing I've done is the superhero game S5E, Super Heroic Role Playing for 5th edition. You can buy it. Pinnacle Entertainment Group actually bought it from me, so they have it on sale on their website. So I don't actually get any money from it anymore, but it's fun if you want to use your D&D rules.
Drop it in chat, in the group chat, and I'll drop it in because it's not letting you drop the link in.
Oh, the link. Okay, there you go.
Right,
yeah, it's uses D&D rules to play a superhero game.
Nice. And I did back it. It's one of the ones I want to play at some point soon. All right, and Enrique.
So you could find me on Twitter, NewbieDM, pretty much NewbieDM on Blue Sky and Instagram, not on Facebook or Instagram. And then I have a pretty cool product up on Drive-Thru. It's called NewbieDM Spell, and it's a basically 5e spell templates for 20. So they have graphics and colors, and they're kind of cool looking. So if you find struggling with spell layouts and whatnot for your stats on Roll20, well, my spell templates, and they're pretty cheap. I keep on purpose so people could just pick them up and play them. Basically, you just drag them onto your Roll20 tabletop, and they're good to go.
I am Scott or Zeal, and we have got products on Drive-Thru RPG, both 5e, and we dropped our first Cypher product a few months ago. We're in the middle of a couple other Cypher products too, and potentially a whole system. More to come on that. We will see you in a couple of weeks. We're going to take a week off. I always take the first week of the month off so I can watch Tales from the Tavern with Gamer Mom Luna, who is one of my favorite people online of all people. And the Super Bowl's coming up, and who wants to compete with that? So there's no point even being on, I don't think. There just won't be anybody there. Have a good night, everybody. We will see you in a couple of weeks. And watch our old Gods of Appalachia streams. They're on Wednesday, and in a couple of weeks we'll be starting a Tuesday one. So we'll see you then. Take care, everybody. Bye.